give you an interview and see what your thoughts were on the subject of systemic racism, Dungeons and Dragons, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and your experiences in real life too. I mean, people don't hear a lot about that, or maybe they do. Maybe I just live in a bubble. So
Yeah, I mean, I guess probably what will be useful is just, I can speak to some of my own history. So, I'm born in the Fiji Islands, in a
right.
very traditional Indian, Fijian Indian household, very religious household as well. So,
Right.
that was sort of my worldview, and like Fiji in itself at the time was it was a very isolated country as far as it has this tourism industry, but everything else is kind of like the vibe is very much sort of India in the 60s. It's still quite sort of rural and agrarian and so forth.
Right.
Then my folks leave before the Fijian coup happens, and we end up I end up in the U.S. in California. So it's sort of like my first real experience with other cultures, with white culture.
Right. How long were you there for?
I was there for almost 5 years, I think.
Wow, I was there for 5 years just recently. So
There you go. Exactly. So you've like 5 years is a long enough time, especially when you're young, to sort of absorb a lot of this culture and sort of find yourself in this kind of crossroads of who you were told you're meant to be versus what what the alternatives are.
Right.
And in my case, it was like this Central Californian late 1980s sort of perspective on the world.
Right.
Then we moved again, and we sort of spent a little bit of time in a few other countries, Singapore and Australia, before settling down in New Zealand in the early 90s. And so I've been in New Zealand since the early 90s onwards, sort of growing up here. And that in of itself was an amazing kind of contrast, because the race, not the race politics, but sort of like this social approach to race and culture is very different in New Zealand than it is to California, which is, again, very different to Fiji. So it's like I've had a taste of like 4 or 5 different flavors of how people integrate in society, how minorities integrate, and seeing that evolve over time, especially because I keep in touch a lot with friends in the U.S. and I follow the U.S. quite a bit because I understand it. And then contrasting that with New Zealand and sort of seeing New Zealand's evolution as well. It's been interesting. My personal take on it is that New Zealand's definitely improved. I think that New Zealand was a very difficult country to be a minority in the early 90s, but that's changed quite a bit. At least in the areas that I live in, and the U.S. has kind of been sort of the opposite. I think, where it hasn't embraced its newfound sort of 21st century awakening in terms of the fact that it is culturally evolving, and there's this massive culture of pushback, which is very, very interesting. I mean, but not always, though, obviously, because there's still tremendous amounts of progress being made, especially with stuff like the Me Too movement and with race and so forth. So I mean, that's kind of my background. I would identify myself as a displaced person of color, if anything. So I'm kind of quite displaced from my Indian heritage, because my experiences growing up once I left Fiji was very alienating, and therefore I could not integrate into the various Indian communities that I found myself in other parts of the world, including New Zealand. But as I've also grown older, it's this thing where, if you're displaced in one, you feel like you belong in another. And it takes you a very long time to slowly realize, hang on a second, even though I kind of feel like I belong as part of this majority population, I'm starting to notice very, 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 very subtle, just these subtle differences of how people treat me, even my friends treat me, compared to how other people treat me. Or even if they don't treat me differently, but then they're kind of like, there's a sort of a lack of knowledge of, or lack of appreciation of the fact that I don't have the same upbringing, and therefore they kind of find it very weird. It's like, well, same upbringing. You know, I'm Indian from Fiji. I'm not a white guy from, from Auckland. You know,
Yeah, right.
So for me, like, it puts me in a really weird position sometimes because um, I can kind of relate to a lot of people's issues in terms of both the need for change and the pushback, but at the same time, I also find myself kind of uninvested sometimes because it's not because I don't want to be invested, but just because I don't have that sense of belonging to any particular community. All I see is everyone else fighting for their sense of belonging, and I really want to encourage that and support that as much as I can.
Right.
But
That makes
yeah,
sense.
I don't have any um I even to this day I still don't have any personal like my personal stakes are very much for other people's sense of well-being and happiness, whereas
Right.
for me I just kind of look at everything on a slightly more academic level, which is probably not a good thing, but yeah, that's just who I am.
Fair enough. I noticed in the States myself that one of the biggest one of the biggest differences between my perceptions of living in California and the reality was um, what they portray in the media and versus the actual, like the ethnicities that are portrayed in the media
Yes,
versus the actual reality of living in California and Los Angeles.
absolutely.
Two different things, California is full of colored people, like
Hmm.
lots and lots of different colored people. It's not this blanket white controlled, white run, white populated
Hmm.
area. I mean, I lived in Hollywood for a little while, and that was a little bit more that way, funnily enough. And, yeah, so it was kind of shocking to me how different the media portrays, how they portray themselves, and how much control the media has over how people do perceive just ethnicity. I mean, being a
Usually, I remember growing up in the '80s. Just, I mean, I wasn't familiar enough with it to know what it was, but obviously, so I mean, California was part of Mexico for decades and decades and decades before it was sort of it was won over by the U.S. So,
right,
but the Spanish remnant just it runs all the way up the western seaboard, and it was just weird as a immigrant kid walking around, and there's this sort of like waspy white culture of the people around of the United States, and yet everywhere I look there's just all these Spanish holdovers, Spanish names, Spanish missions, Spanish
right,
churches, and it's kind of like, you know as a naive kid I just thought that was kind of normal for the American sort of experience and the American cultural scheme, but now I
right,
kind of realize now that it's like, oh wow, that's just the stuff that everyone just sort of just doesn't look at. They just sort
right.
of turn a
And
blind eye to it and don't
there's
include
this
it in their media.
there's this weird insistence on monolingualism as well. Like
Oh
nobody,
yeah.
a lot of people just refuse to try and learn any other languages. Like we just don't need to. Why should we? It's our country. Um, and I mean, I lived in China for 3 years and I learned Chinese.
Yeah, it's like I can't imagine anyone trying to live and make a living practically in California, especially Southern California, and not at least having like a smattering of Spanish. I mean, come
Right,
on.
right.
But people are quite adamant about it. They just don't want to sort of face that, which is
Yeah,
it.
it's absurd to me, but okay, whatever.
Yeah. But it's that culture of I don't know. I guess it's that kind of that fear of losing yourself if you integrate something else rather than the excitement of discovering something new. That
Right,
seems to be the war, right? And that kind of is permeated across all matters of uh, consumer culture as well now. And I think in,
right,
in in geekdom, that's a big thing now as well.
right. Yeah, so this new module, this new book is coming out from Wizards of the Coast on November the 17th, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Have
Yes.
you heard anything about it? Do you know anything about it?
I've only just read some of the basic press releases,
Hmm.
and I had heard about the controversy they had around how they're going to basically sort of reclassify how races were and species were used
Right.
in the character building system, but only just in terms of the controversy of it. Obviously, I've done a little bit more reading about it, in the lead up to it.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
No, fair enough. Yeah. So what are your thoughts about this? Have you had any bad experiences with role-playing games? That's my first question.
I haven't had any bad experiences. what I've noticed particularly, and I've realized now that being, you know, being someone of my age, where I think I've also been trained from a very young age to let this stuff pass, whereas I think younger people these days are being sort of educated to go, hang on a second, and look at something and question it. There's definitely a homogeneity in role-playing games,
right?
100%, and the kind of usage of non-white cultural iconography and symbols and context and ideas as exoticism or as tokenism,
colonialism.
Yeah, exactly. That stuff, for the longest time, it felt like, for the longest time, for someone of my age, it's always felt like a kind of a cultural victory. Well, at least we're sort of making a dent somewhere. People are, it's the hope that by fetishizing aspects of foreign cultures, it could allow people's intolerances of foreign things reduce. And to some degree, I mean, I think that the first stage of any kind of cultural integration, it is that, it is just, I can't remember who it was who said it, but there's this whole idea about how, like, food is like one of the very first borders that you cross. It's like once a society gets a taste for exotic food, it makes, it humanizes the people of that thing, to a degree, and then it stops.
Right.
It looks more harder. So for me, I was okay with how homogenous role playing always has been, and I've also been very conscious that the role-playing systems come from D&D, and D&D comes from essentially Tolkien, and so there's this kind of lineage of what the stuff comes from, and therefore it's carrying over these tropes and these ideas, and culture is nothing but, usually just tropes and ideas and memes that just sort of perpetuate.
Right.
But in saying that, now that I'm of a certain age and I've seen a lot of stuff and I've watched a lot of things and played a lot of games and I've just consumed a lot of mass media, it's really hard to not notice how tropey everything is and how homogenous everything is, and how it's like, the sort of why do we do it this way? Oh, because it's how it's always been done, which was never in geek and nerd culture for me, was never, it was never a value. It was a value of sort of larger society, but seeing it bleed into geek and nerd culture, it's just the way it's always been.
Especially considering how innovative role-playing as an idea is to begin with.
Exactly. It's that lack of innovation is just sort of, and I can understand it's because geek culture is now mass consumer culture. It's no longer, we are no longer the outsiders. We are the primary economic movers. Yeah,
that's true.
And so it's solidified.
You can blame Matt Mercer for that.
Yeah. Indeed. But that is one of the things that I find really interesting, is that those kind of very conservative, mainstream sort of values that once helped shun nerds and geeks and pushed us into the outside has now become the mainstay of, like, this is the way it has to be. This is what we fought for, respect for. How dare you change it? Which is, I think, very interesting.
And curiously, the nerd culture was the most equipped to deal with the internet age and to use it as a tool and as a weapon, if you like.
Yes, indeed. And I think that, which makes sense, because now that the internet age is part of the mainstream age, there are they become the large sort of dominant forces of this kind of these very, very hegemonic ideas of how things should be in terms of, franchises and geek IP and all that kind of stuff. Yes, and it's interesting. It is, and I do find it personally very kind of, sad and distressing, the amount of pushback that is happening. But I'm also empathetic. It's kind of like, it's like if you spent 20 years of your life playing D&D in your, in a basement or in a library because you're being bullied for it and persecuted by your parents and your aunts and uncles. And then all of a sudden, everyone's basically saying, "Hey, we're going to change D&D now, so to make it more available." I can understand why some people would just kind of go, well, no, fuck you. How dare you? This is
Right.
what, this is the thing that actually made me.
This is my thing. God damn it.
Exactly. And I've worked so hard to make it this thing, and now you want to change it on me. I have a lot of sympathy for that. I really, really
Right.
do.
Right. No, that's fair enough. The
Yeah.
interesting thing to me, though, is that the rules that they're creating, this new system that they're bringing into D&D for character creation and character backgrounds, lineages, and what have you, it's all optional.
Yes, of course it is.
It's optional. It's not like you have to use it. Nobody's forcing you to do it, And there's still plenty of old style, hegemonic style games around if you want to, really return to your roots, so to speak. It's not as if you're forced to do this. So yeah, I find it kind of absurd that people are getting so upset about it. One of the things, one of the criticisms I keep coming across, it seems to me, is a bit of a straw man argument, which is essentially, like Drow, for example, are one of the races that they're going to alter somewhat, in so much as you're not going to automatically be evil as a Drow anymore.
Yes.
Now, as we know, Drow are the dark elves in D&D, and they have dark skin. And it always, ever since I was a kid, I always thought that was a bit weird and a little bit racist. I mean, I was brought up in Papua New Guinea, as I said, and so this kind of stuff sort of strikes me straight off the bat. And I'm sure it's affected, and other people have noticed this too. But the argument tends to be, well, if they'd been white and evil, nobody would have said boo. And is that true? What do you think about that?
I think that I think there is definitely some truth to that, and I think what it is that it's not a pushback against the rules. I think it's a pushback against a kind of cultural symbolism that that we've all grown up with. The idea that if it's ugly, it's evil. If it's dark, it's evil. It's there's
or if it's a little bit too seductive as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That there's a defined rule set and a defined skill set in Western fiction that things have to adhere to. Otherwise, I think the argument they would put forward is that it loses its effectiveness, but the argument really is that a lot of people just don't know how to a lot of storytelling, a lot of D&D, a lot of even fiction is based on tropes. And I think people fear having their tropes taken away from them and having them forced to sort of swim on their own. It's the argument that the argument I always come across is sort of like, and it always seems to boil down to, well, you can't do that because then there's no story. And it's like, well, a story can be anything, anything in your imagination can capture should be a story. Why do you have to use this thing as the villain? It's like
alignments are like this kind of pre-digested drama and conflict that you don't have to actually think about. Therefore, you just have this excuse to go out and kill stuff, without really having to admit the fact that you just want to go out and kill stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You don't never have to face your shadow. That's an interesting element of it to me.
I mean, look, I can totally. And again, I have all the sympathy in the world for people who just love power gaming. They just want to go out there and just, crawl through dungeons and kill goblins.
Gives them agency and escape,
Exactly, and not worry about whether the goblin had a family or a wife waiting for him back home, whatever kind of thing, which is fine. And it's the escapism of violence is definitely part of what makes humans. And I understand.
And catharsism. Catharsism, is that a word?
It could be. Yeah, fine.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
But for me, it's kind of the thing of like, that's. But I think what makes that escapism easy is tropes. Tropes force you to not have to worry about, well, why is this, why is this and why is that? Why is this, why is this thing good and why is that thing bad? They just are because it's like, oh, it's ugly and dark skin and lives in a dungeon. That therefore it must be bad. Therefore I don't have to think about those things.
Right.
And I think stuff like this, on a subconscious level, I believe it challenges people. It makes them worry that their tropes will be taken away from them. They worry that their escapism will be taken away from them. And which to be fair, on one level, I understand. On level, escapism is a privilege,
Right. That's true.
it's
Yeah. I mean,
because
a lot of people don't have the option, do they? They have to live in
no,
squalor or whatever the situation is. They just have to deal
absolutely,
with it.
and their escapism could be quite different. Like it's just that thing of like, if I encounter a lot of people online who just, it's that thing. Everyone's just assuming the entire world has exactly the same values and exactly the same outlook on life that they do in their hometown, not realizing that there's completely different kinds of tropes and escapist fantasies in other parts of the world that would probably upset them or make them feel very icky. I mean, but it's completely normal, and it's just those things. And I think that maybe is one of the issues, is that D&D is so middle class. It's so white. It's such a, it's
also very American too. I mean,
it's very American.
One of the things I notice about D&D particularly, as I've been sort of re-exploring it more recently, because I used to play it back in the 80s and I've played it on and off for 30 something years, but I've gone away from it and come back to it. And I'm noticing how capitalist it is. Like it's not feudal. It's supposed to be this feudal medieval fantasy society, or so that's what I thought. And now I'm sort of realizing, wow, we go out, we kill stuff, we collect loot and treasure. It's all about greed and capitalism. Why aren't the motives and the plot hooks and the adventure hooks about, other things, other types of motives, that things that motivate characters and objectives that can motivate characters to work together to do stuff? It doesn't have to just be about making money and getting power.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very it's a very American middle class fantasy. You by vanquishing foes and gaining loot, you become the hero of your own story. You become a hero of the local community, and it just perpetuates until you die, which is I mean, that is the American escapist fantasy, and D&D sort of caters to that, to what the people who were once America's middle class white outliers. I mean, people don't I think younger people don't remember this, but D&D is expensive.
Right.
It's fucking expensive. I did not, I got into tabletop at university because other people played it, and there were rule books being shared around, and there was people would make me character sheets and stuff. I could not afford the money to buy one rule book in the 80s. It was goddamn expensive because I wasn't middle class.
Well, I lived in, as I said, Papua New Guinea. We didn't have bookstores in Papua New Guinea. I had to wait for my grandparents to fly up to PNG to visit us one year, and they bought me like 3 or 4 books, which I'd been just dying for like 2 years. It was, that was painful. And now we've got D&D Beyond. There's so many options to obtain access. Even D&D Beyond, you can share a campaign with someone, and now you can actually share your content, your books with them.
Absolutely. I mean, like Wizards of the Coast give away the starter pack for free. Essentially, you can play D&D without too many of the rules for free, and it's like that was absolutely unheard of. So it was. And the thing was that, like, when I became middle class, I sort of went into computer gaming because I didn't have the avenue, the early enough avenue for D&D, and I mean, I was still a kid who essentially had no pocket money, so essentially it was just like whatever my folks got for me for the computer was it. I think, like, to me, it's really what the stuff really is about is just that there is a massive generation, there's a massive culture around D&D that is, in my view, antiquated because it's so 20th century. But I think a lot of D&D's infrastructure and economy today is built up by these people. They became the pillars of the community to some degree because they sort of provided the economics for it to grow. And seeing that threatened, and seeing everything that they're familiar with, even just the option, if you give someone the option to change their D&D, it's deeply threatening to them.
That's so bizarre to me.
It is to me as well, but it's kind of, Yeah, it's just that thing, because and they have all these tools to sort of fall back on. Well, they go, well, that's not what Gary Gygax imagined, and and if you go further than back, it's like, well, we have Tolkien, and Tolkien basically, has made it very, very clear that these are the things, and then you got the weirdos who claim that it's all based on
Yeah.
like European history, which is like whatever, but
Right.
really
Right.
you
I
haven't
mean,
done European history.
there's
So it's undoing, it's battling how they perceive that all that is being undone for them. They've
right.
invested in this European high fantasy setting,
Right.
which obviously has evolved through the
Right.
last 40 years, but they don't really care about that. I mean, you look at D&D first set, and even
Hmm.
the artwork is so, it's very Conan the Barbarian. It's the
Right.
Hyperborean age.
Franzetta kind of style, lots of
Exactly. And now it's
tits and
like
ass
D&D
and
is but like you play, like you look at like Baldur's Gate or the artwork in the new rule books, it's set in the Renaissance. Like everything is all fucking Renaissance, and steampunk is getting into it now as well. So
right.
it's
See,
like
that's my objection is I freaking hate steampunk, and how dare they put that shit in my D&D? It's supposed to
yeah,
be medieval high fantasy. What is all this crap? How
yeah,
did that?
exactly.
And it feels to me like they're just copying World of Warcraft, which copied them to begin with. There's this kind
Yeah,
of cyclic feedback thing that's going on, and I
indeed.
hate that. That's what threatens me.
Exactly. I mean, I don't like steampunk just because it's. I mean, I don't like steampunk only because the rule sets don't make any sense for me. It's like it's
Mm,
either magic or it isn't. Just pick one,
mm.
guys. I'll take either one. But for
Well,
me, I don't mind that they're diving into that, because I think it's that thing. It's like the idea of the purity of D&D is, it's like trying to say that like movies made in the 40s were better than movies made in the 90s.
right,
Like it's a
right,
completely weird argument for me. I think for it to move on, Wizards of the Coast have to take their product and go, look, what does fantasy mean to people today?
right.
And they have to adopt that. They really do. Otherwise, I mean,
Yeah,
it's a product. It's a capitalistic product.
right.
They have to make money off it,
Yeah. Otherwise,
and
they
they can,
die. Yeah.
exactly, yeah, and they can do what they want with it, just in whatever form they want to. But in saying that, yeah, I mean, the backlash is kind of is. I think it's indicative that I think it's a big indicator that culture is changing around what D&D is and and
Mm,
what that stuff means.
right.
And I think that's, it's when culture changes that there's usually a lot of screaming and yelling and
Right.
throwing
Right.
things.
So of course, all of this stuff, all of this stuff that we're talking about, I mean, well, not maybe not all of it, but a great deal of it also relates to uh, sexual politics as well, or gender
Yes.
politics, shall we say? Yeah, I mean, there's a whole movement of feminism coming up through the ranks of D&D as well, which is really awesome to see. Finally,
Mm,
women playing D&D, women DMs. Oh my God, thank God
yeah.
for that, because
Yes.
I've never played with a woman DM. Actually, that's not true. I have, but not very often, and it's a rare thing. And I think for men to live or exist in a simulacrum created by women would be very enlightening to them.
I think that again, it's just that thing where it's like, this perception in the 80s that, that, oh well, girls aren't going to be interested in this thing, and
Right?
80s culture telling girls you're not supposed to be interested in this thing.
It's an
um
assumption.
it's created this kind of, like, this thing was divisive. It was the chains that sort of tore apart a whole youth demographic. But what's happened is that people have kind of gilded these chains and wear it around as some kind of badge of honor. It's like, aha, it's like, this is a man's thing. This is the man's realm.
Right. Right.
Girl, no girls around. Fuck you, girls. And
Right.
it's like, guys, like, this is like, don't you remember back in like the 80s when you used to like sometimes wonder if like maybe if there'd be some cute girls who want to play this with you? It's like,
Right.
no, I don't remember that at all.
For sure. Yeah. I remember being in a group in PNG. Actually, there was a small group, and there was one of the boys' sisters wanted to play, and they wouldn't let her. I was like, why?
Why
What's your
not?
problem? Why can't she play? Like, she was a little bit younger than us. Maybe that was the other reason, perhaps, but that's also a terrible reason. I mean,
Yeah,
there's so many educational and other really positive elements to role playing that I think, especially coming to light these days, there's some research being done in these areas, and how it improves all sorts of cognitive and language abilities. Yeah, I mean, really useful for autistic children, for example. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. There's definitely a lot of positive stuff coming out of it, but yes, we still have a lot of these old remnant problems. I'm sure I had another question for you. I guess this was just a sort of a side note, and I wondered whether it would come up, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, and I'm not
sure.
sure if it's a great idea. Now,
Mm.
you acted on Xena at one point, right?
Yes, I did.
So what kind of character did you play on Xena, and how did you feel about it?
That was very interesting. So I played a character called named Indrajit. He is a minor character from Indian mythology. His dad is basically a character named Ravana, and he was the big bad, end boss of the Indian epic, the Ramayana. So
All right.
so he basically is this kind of like classic mythological villain, though not a villain everywhere in India. Half of India literally treats him as a god. So
Wow.
that's kind of interesting. So a lot of interesting ethical, moral ambiguity around that. So yeah, there was a 4-part series of Xena Warrior Princess where Xena and Gabrielle go down to India. I can't remember how or why they end up down there.
Right.
Essentially, but what happens is, so they have 4 adventures in India, and
Hmm.
mine was the final episode. And the final episode was essentially they attract the attention of Indrajit, who has inherited Ravana's kingdom after Ravana was killed, and he's a demon king.
Right.
The episode also features essentially 2 other Indian gods, Hanuman and Krishna, who basically they come out of the blue and essentially so Deus Ex Machina help
Right.
like literal Deus Ex Machina,
Right. Right.
sort of like help Xena defeat me. And the interesting outcome for that particular episode, especially, was that the episode is now banned. It's banned across the world.
Really? Oh my
Yeah,
God. I did not know that.
and the reason why it was banned was because one particular very, very ultra conservative Hindu group, a Hindu lobby group in the US,
Right.
took exception to it.
On
Um,
what was their grounds?
their grounds was that because they basically said, look, Xena and Gabrielle, they are basically coded lesbians. Everyone knows this, and our belief, this is the lobby group's belief, not the belief of Hinduism in any way, shape, or form, but
Right.
their belief, their particular branch of Hinduism was like, we will not have our gods represented in a television show helping out 2 lesbians, and which is
Wow.
and I was just like, oh fuck you, that's terrible. That's
And
a really, really like shitty position to take.
right. They're
But
not even overtly lesbians. So that's the sad
no,
part, you
well,
know?
I mean, I guess their story arc kind of goes that way eventually, but at this stage, they were just code. They were just
Right.
coded characters.
Right.
Um, and there's other stuff too, like it was one of the most violent episodes of
Oh, really?
Xena that ever produced. There was like beheadings and decapitations and arms being lifted off and stuff
Oh
like that,
no.
in sort of like that classic Xena cartoony style.
Hmm. Yeah.
But because this lobby group made like kicked up such a fuss, and this is the late '90s, so like having this kind of controversy was, it was a big deal because there wasn't much else going on around the time in that kind of
Right.
thing. So in the landscape of it, they just went, look, let's just. So they edited the episode down.
Mm.
They put a disclaimer in front of it, essentially saying that they are sorry for any kind of liberties that were taken.
Right.
It screened in the US, and then after it screened, it was just removed so that it basically, um,
Wow.
any platforms that already had it, they were going to screen that, but they were not going to do any more releases of that
Do
episode.
you have a copy of it?
I do. In actual fact, believe it or not, the whole thing is on Netflix. So
Oh,
obviously
really?
Netflix got
Oh, okay.
hold of the series before they actually pulled the episode. So if you actually do have Netflix, at least in New Zealand,
Right.
the New Zealand Netflix has the episode. It's episode 16, season 4. It's called The
60.
Way.
Can you write that in the chat for me?
Yeah,
I'm going to
sure.
track that down at some point.
Yeah.
Sounds like fun.
Episode 16, season 4.
Hilarious.
Yeah, and
Cool,
I mean, it's like that episode's really. I mean, that whole arc is really interesting because it really falls into the category of, well, at least we're on screen, even if it's all completely weird and dumb and strange.
Right.
And it was like, I was literally dressed up like a Mughal king from like the 16th century rather than an Indian prince from, like pre-BC times.
Century. Okay,
I flew in a magic carpet, which is like,
of course
not even the it's like,
there's some Orientalism there for you.
Oh my God. Like magic carpets are distinctly from our like Persian Gulf territory mythology. They've never traveled anywhere else outside that region. We got that got worked into it. They had all the cinematic tropes, like everywhere they met, all the peasants in all the villages were just dressed in like brown. It's like, these are Indians. These people wouldn't be caught dead wearing brown. They'd die. Even if they're poor, they'd make sure that they're close. So there's a lot of huge amounts of liberties taken. In saying that, their depiction of Krishna, of Hanuman, of Kali, who possesses Dina in order to fight me, fucking bang on. Like, they nailed it. Like, they look amazing. They look better than some of the depictions of how our gods are depicted in our cinema. Like, they did a fantastic job. And they really kind of captured the vibe of what those characters were about, which is awesome, And, like, my entire experience for that as an actor in the late 90s was super positive. They cared enough to at least try to get some stuff right. They made no like incorrect assumptions about things that they didn't that they should have known was correct, and so forth.
They knew what they were getting wrong too, I would expect.
They like the stuff they got wrong. I think I honestly feel about like half of the stuff they got wrong, they just didn't know. Like, I mean, like my costume design, I think was just like, this is like early, like this is like before even Google was big. You'd have to go to like, I don't know, Yahoo to find your image sources and encyclopedias.
And then spend half an hour downloading each image.
Exactly. So, it's like what they managed to cobble together based on their limited resources. I was seriously impressed. Like, I thought it was going to be like 1,000 times worse.
Wow.
And it wasn't. I think that as far as representation goes for the late 90s for a fantasy show made in New Zealand, it's great. It's absolutely, it's completely like, it is very, very dated and, and makes a lot of really kind of weird assumptions about things. At the same time, it's also the very first time I'd ever seen Indian actors, me, myself included, playing featured roles, on a major primetime American television series, especially a sci-fi fantasy one, because, there was tons of Indian actors, all, in the US and, for generations, but we just have no representation, no presence on television. So, and for me, I think that kind of exoticism, that fetishization, the tokenism of it, and the way it's worked into tabletop systems through the 90s, it was the first barriers of entry that were being breached. It's fun talking about the stuff, and it's despite how negative the shit can get for people and so forth.
Well, the fact that we have the opportunity to talk about it, and the fact that maybe talking about it will actually bring something to light for someone, that's
absolutely.
That's what my hope is. Maybe we can make some kind of difference by actually discoursing and not slinging shit at one another.
Yes.
So yeah, I guess the other question I was going to ask, and going back to the original kind of theme of this conversation, which was about Dungeons and Dragons and the changes that are coming. What kind of characters do you play in D&D?
I always tend to play rogues. I don't know why. I just like them. I like, it's the dynamic that I can play in parties when I'm a rogue character is it just makes it's fine. It's cool. I used to never play magic users. I used to be quite terrified of magic systems, but
the
I kind
system
of
is hard.
yeah, well, it actually isn't that hard. I was just kind of like, it just looked like a lot of work, you know. And but I got forced to playing a magic user in my current campaign that I'm playing because the party had no one else. And I was like, oh, okay, fine. I guess I'll play a sorcerer, and I'm actually really enjoying it. So I think I'll definitely have to take up magic characters in the future. They're actually a lot of fun.
Right.
So that's been a bit of a discovery for me. Yeah, racially, I I have always played humans, and it's really interesting because I'm actually thinking about why. And I mean, to be fair, a lot of the D&D campaigns I've had, the species selections were actually quite narrow, and
based on the DM or the module.
Usually the module / DM. So there wasn't like I don't think I've ever played a D&D campaign where playing an orc was an option until this current one, and then I still chose human.
Right.
Oddly enough, I would always usually play a female. Just I guess it was my own it's like, well, I can't really. It was just my own subconscious desire to be a bit of the other in the campaign.
Right. The
really
animus aspect.
Yes. And also it's like, well, there's no. It's like, well, I mean, up until I think the 3rd edition or 4th edition, when they actually started to sort of diversify the humans into cultures and skin tones, there was no dark-skinned humans to play unless you just picked one. Like, well, I am dark-skinned, but it makes no difference. I'm just like everyone else now. And they're like, okay, fine. I mean, that's fine, but it's kind of, it's I felt like it was just like a costume. It wasn't being authentic to something. And now playing, and so I would end up playing a female character because then at least that felt like I could at least role play something that was different, especially because most people in my parties wouldn't. Ironically, the Ravenloft campaign I'm playing currently right now is all female bar one.
Oh wow!
So it's like we have two female players, and then myself and another male character both chose female as well. So it's just this sort of party of gals and this one very, very shy policeman character.
So do you guys play tabletop on like in real life? It's like an actual thing, or are you playing on Discord, or how do you?
Oh no, we play in real life. I'm a big fan of playing in real life just because I just love the socializing. It's just in saying that during lockdown we had to play via Zoom, and that was tons of fun actually. I ended up playing like D&D in bed under a blanket. It was great.
I've been amazed actually how fun it is playing on Zoom. I use D&D Beyond as a tool.
Yes.
And so you just share screen and you can roll dice and everybody can see it, and it works perfectly. And I've got like a second camera with a second Zoom account, so I've got that pointed at my battle map, so I can have miniatures and stuff.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, we did that. Actually, that's what our DM did, was they actually got a second Zoom account for their cell phone, and that was just that became sort of like the tabletop map whenever we needed to use it.
Exactly, it's fine. Yeah.
It's funny though. One thing that now that I'm thinking about this, one of the criticisms that I've seen being bandied about the whole sort of changes being made to sort of class and gender is this whole idea that it's like, well, if everyone's the same, then everyone's the same. It takes the variety out of playing, which is interesting. I mean, because I do think that.
To set things straight a little bit there, it's also there's going to be a series of background traits that you can choose that will differentiate you, and it's not going to be your race that differentiates you so much as the other traits that go with that might be cultural or
exactly.
We haven't seen it yet.
Exactly, and I that's sort of what makes me sort of like think about this, because it's like when I was playing like Second Ed, and it's like, it's like you would really have to work very, very hard to go, well, I'm a dark-skinned human, and therefore here is my, and work really hard to build up a background character for yourself, just to differentiate you and give you things to play off your other party members. And if your DM wasn't interested, then it was always very difficult. Whereas now in the current editions, it's, it's much easier to do that. And I think it's the same thing. It's like, I think that is the counter to that criticism. It's like, look, it's the stats on my sheet shouldn't be the thing that makes me different from you. It should be the storytelling that I'm doing, because I'm from a different part of the world. I have a different accent. I have different cultural values, and you have to sort of engage with me on that stuff. And that's the stuff that really should diversify species and classes, not, you're this thing, therefore you have this strength bonus and this, this weakness, whatever. Because ultimately it's like, half the time people don't play that anyway. I mean, it's tabletop. It's so verbal, as an experience, and it's like only the really good players can play that in their story. Whereas, knowing for a fact that, the orcs have this massively diverse culture that you have to deal with when you have an orc in your party, and they have these values. I mean, to me, it's like, I mean, it's the same thing. It's, what makes Klingons really interesting, especially like, when they were sort of grown as a species and a culture in the 90s. It wasn't the fact that they were big, angry, and strong. It's the fact that they had this kind of completely different cultural value system.
Well, they kind of started off as this weird kind of Russian communist thing, as far as I could tell. That was my first impression of Klingons.
Exactly. And then when they actually, when the Next Generation came out and the Berlin Wall fell, and they're like, hey, we have to actually, these people are just people, we understand them. And then all of a sudden they sort of made these, they made them like incredibly likable. Like, at least to me, they're very charismatic people, who like, well, okay, sure, that, their entire culture is based around endurance and taking pain, but it's not the fact that they can take pain and they kind of enjoy it, that makes them interesting. It's the fact that they've built a culture around that. And it affects how they interact with the Federation. And it's that kind of stuff, which I think a lot of the pushback just really comes from people who just don't seem to want to role play like that. They don't want to think about role playing games as that. And that's,
in fact, and I get the impression too that ultimately it's about just not wanting to role play, to be honest. I mean, they want, as I earlier said, pre-digested kind of conflict, so they don't have to put any work into that or consider any elements of storytelling. Essentially, you might as well just roll a random dungeon up from the DM's guide.
Absolutely. And they're, there's that fear that, well, if all these rules are being thrown out, then therefore I can't get this prepackaged thing where I'm going to be the tank in the party because I picked this class and this species, and this gender. And because someone else might just decide that they're the tank, even though they don't actually have any of those things anymore. And it's a real like false dilemma. It's like they're sort of like concocting these incredibly hostile D&D sessions, and like really like sort of like jerk ass, fellow players who are not going to actually, go through the system and actually play it properly. And that's kind of the interesting thing I find. I mean, that's the Strawman argument, is that you have to make everyone else in the world, these incredibly obnoxious people who don't want to play with you, in order for these changes to actually affect your game.
And there's some very toxic games out there. I mean, I've run into them myself, especially as a kid, but even more recently I've heard some stories that have made me go, oh my God, there are people like this, and they're in their 30s and 40s and 50s, and wow, just shocking.
Oh, I mean, they're in game shops. They're sidelining at D&D cons and yelling at their own kids about that kind of stuff.
The stories that you hear from women getting into D&D. I mean, I've recently had an interview with a lady who's hiring a dungeon master for a job, and she's interested in me, but she basically said, "I wish you were a woman," which understandably. But it took her till she was 30 something before she could even get into a game, because nobody would let her play. That's just shocking. Like, really? No one would let you play because you're a woman? That is some sad. I do not have the words for that, at least none that I can say on TV.
And the last thing I guess for me is that it's also important for us to remember that, these kinds of controversies are just, I mean, they're beautiful, beautiful dog whistles for people who actually want to stir up that controversy. So it's very, very easy for like white supremacists to essentially just go, oh, this is a new thing, fine, I'll log into an account, I'll get onto this D&D forum, and I'll just start
Talking
complaining
shit,
because,
right?
because they do feel it as some kind of a threat, and then all of a sudden and they start feeding out these easily disprovable false narratives. But if you don't think about them too hard, they seem correct. They have this kind of flat earthism, kind of oh, it's just common sense, this is going to happen sort of thing, which a lot of impressionable young people just hop onto, and go, well, yeah, absolutely, this is why these things shouldn't change. And it's important for us to sort of remind ourselves who's doing the most complaining. Is it actual D&D players, or is it them being, egged on by dog whistlers and people who just have, it's in their best interest for
the vocal minority?
Yes, yes, a very, very vocal minority.
Right.
Because that's the other thing, I guess, is that one of the things as a minority I've always learned, and this is shared across all minorities I've ever come across, is that real minorities in who feel underprivileged, who have grown up with a sense of being a minority and having to fit in. We're not very vocal. We really, really aren't. Like this.
You can't afford to be, can you?
You can't afford to be. Like in like this whole like with Black Lives Matter, it's a game changer. It's a real game changer, because it's for the first time people are just kind of, whether it's through desperation or cultural change or just communication or a larger understanding of their own history, they're finally going, actually, hang on a second, we probably should say something. Because not saying something has not worked out very well. But it's hard. It's really, really hard. I encounter a lot of racism within the Indian community. And the racism isn't that they actually, feel superior to other people. The racism is that they want to be the best behaved minority, so that when the backlash happens, they don't catch the flack.
Right.
So they're they're more than happy to be co-conspirators in their own oppression, as long as it doesn't give them the flack. Which I feel a lot of that is kind of, that kind of is one of my culture's big issues as far as Indian minorities are concerned in Western countries, because we have this sort of reputation of being sort of hardworking, good people who just, we don't cause trouble, blah, 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 blah. But in actual fact, what it is that our communities themselves are torn apart in a big way because of just this kind of silencing of Indian identity.
Well, I've heard the same phenomena occurring in other minorities too. Asian minorities, particularly in America, Filipino minorities. This guy named James Mendez Hodes, I will send you a link to his blog. Actually, he's got some really interesting stuff. Yeah, but anyway, I guess this really needs to be the end of this interview, because we've been going for an hour and 7 minutes, and we've all got stuff to do, and I've got people in the house.
You
want to fix things, apparently, fix things that are broken, which is what this is all about.
The house is a good use of time, so I shall definitely leave you to it. But it's been a pleasure, as always.
Yeah, thank you, Drudge. Thank you for coming and having a chat. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.